you come up with major differences. Just take the death of Jesus. What day did Jesus die on? And what time of day? Did he die on the day before the Passover meal was eaten, as John explicitly says? Or did he die after it was eaten, as Mark explicitly says? Did he die at noon, as in John, or at 9 a.m., as in Mark? Did Jesus carry his cross the entire way himself, or did Simon of Cyrene carry his cross? It depends which gospel you read. Did both robbers mock Jesus on the cross, or did only one of them mock him and the other come to his defense? It depends which gospel you read. Did the curtain in the temple rip in half before Jesus died or after he died? It depends which gospel you read. Or take the accounts of the resurrection. Who went to the tomb on the third day? Was it Mary alone, or was it Mary with other women? If it was Mary with other women, how many other women were there? Which ones were they, and what were their names? Was the stone rolled away before they got there, or not? What did they see in the tomb? Did they see a man? Did they see two men? Or did they see an angel? It depends which account you read. What were they told to tell the disciples? Were the disciples supposed to go to Jerusalem and see Jesus there? Were they supposed to stay in Jerusalem and see Jesus there? Or were they to go to Galilee and see Jesus there? Did the women tell anyone or not? It depends which gospel you read. Did the disciples never leave Jerusalem? Or did they immediately leave Jerusalem and go to Galilee? All of these depend on which account you read. You have the same problems for all of the sources in all of our gospels. These are not historically reliable accounts. The authors were not eyewitnesses. They're Greek-speaking Christians living 35 to 65 years after the events they narrate. The accounts that they narrate are based on oral traditions that have been in circulation for decades. Year after year, Christians trying to convert others told them stories to convince them that Jesus was raised from the dead. These writers are telling stories then that Christians have been telling all these years. Many stories were invented and most of the stories were changed. For that reason, these accounts are not as useful as we would like them to be for historical purposes. They're not contemporary, they're not disinterested, and they're not consistent. But even if these stories were the best sources in the world, there would still be a major obstacle that we simply cannot overcome if we want to approach the question of the resurrection historically rather than theologically. I'm fine if Bill wants to argue that theologically God raised Jesus from the dead, or even if he wants to argue theologically that Jesus was raised from the dead. But this cannot be a historical claim, and not for the reason that he imputed to me as being an old, warmed over 18th century view that has been refuted ever since. Historians can only establish what probably happened in the past. The problem with historians is they can't repeat the experiment. Today, if we want proof for something, it's very simple to give proof for many things. In the natural sciences, the experimental sciences, we have proof. If I wanted to prove to you that bars of ivory soap float, but bars of iron sink, all I need to do is get 50 tubs of lukewarm water and start chucking in the bars. The ivory soap will always float, the iron will always sink, and after a while we'll have a level of what you might call predictive probability. That if I do it again, the iron's going to sink again and the soap's going to float again. We can repeat the experiments doing experimental science, but we can't repeat the experiments doing history because once history happens, it's over. What are miracles? Miracles are not impossible. I won't say they're impossible. You might think they are impossible. If you do think so, then you're going to agree with my argument even more than I'm going to agree with my argument. I'm just going to say that miracles are so highly improbable that they're the least possible occurrence in any given instance. They violate the way nature naturally works. They are so highly improbable, their probability is infinitesimally remote, that we call them miracles. No one on the face of this earth can walk on lukewarm water. What are the chances that one of us can do it? Well, none of us can. So let's say the chances are 1 in 10 billion. Well, suppose somebody can. Well, then it's a chance of 1 in 10 billion. But in fact, none of us can. What about the resurrection of Jesus? I'm not saying it didn't happen, but if it did happen, it would be a miracle. The resurrection claims are claims that not only did Jesus' body come back to life, it came back to life never to die again. That's a violation of what naturally happens. Every day, time after time, millions of times a year. What are the chances of it happening? Well, it'd be a miracle. In other words, it'd be so highly improbable that we can't account for it by natural means. A theologian may claim that it's true. And to argue with the theologian, we'd have to argue on theological grounds, because there are no historical grounds to argue on. Historians can only establish what probably happened in the past, and by definition, the miracle is the least probable occurrence. And so, by the very nature of the canons of historical research, we can't claim, historically, that a miracle probably happened. By definition, it probably didn't. And history can only establish what probably did. I wish we could establish miracles, but we can't. It's no one's fault. It's simply that the canons of historical research do not allow for the possibility of establishing the as probable, the least probable of all occurrences. For that reason, Bill's 4 pieces of evidence are completely irrelevant. There cannot be historical probability for an event that defies probability, even if the event did happen. The resurrection has to be taken on faith, not on the basis of proof. Let me illustrate by giving you an alternative scenario of what happened to explain the empty tomb. I don't believe this. I don't think it happened this way. But it's more probable than a miracle happened, because a miracle, by definition, is the least probable occurrence. So let me give you a theory, just one I dreamt up. I could dream up 20 of these that are implausible, but are still more plausible than a resurrection. Jesus gets buried by Joseph of Arimathea. 2 of Jesus' family members are upset that an unknown Jewish leader has buried the body. In the dead of night, these 2 family members raid the tomb, taking the body off to bury it for themselves. But Roman soldiers on the lookout see them carrying the shrouded corpse through the streets. They confront them and they kill them on the spot. They throw all 3 bodies into a common burial plot, where within 3 days these bodies are decomposed beyond recognition. The tomb then is empty. People go to the tomb, they find it empty. They come to think that Jesus was raised from the dead. And they start thinking they've seen him, because they know he's been raised because his tomb is empty. This is a highly unlikely scenario. But you can't object that it's impossible to have happened, because it's not. People did raid tombs. Soldiers did kill civilians on the least pretext. People were buried in common graves left to rot. It's not likely, but it's more likely than a miracle, which is so unlikely that you have to appeal to supernatural intervention to make it work. This alternative explanation I've given you, which again is not one that I believe, is at least plausible. And it's historical, as opposed to Bill's explanation, which is not a historical explanation. Bill's explanation is a theological explanation. The evidence that Bill himself doesn't see his explanation as historical is that he claims that his conclusion is that Jesus was raised from the dead. Well, that's a passive. Was raised. Who raised him? Well, presumably God. This is a theological claim about something that happened to Jesus. It's about something that God did to Jesus. But historians cannot presuppose belief or disbelief in God when making their conclusions. Discussions about what God has done are theological in nature. They're not historical. Historians, I'm sorry to say, have no access to God. The canons of historical research are by their very nature restricted to what happens here, on this earthly plane. They do not and cannot presuppose any set beliefs about the natural realm. I'm not saying this is good or bad. It's simply the way historical research works. Let me give you an analogy. It's not bad that there can be no mathematical proof for the existence of an anti-Semitic polemic in the Merchant of Venice.